there's a lot going on here, and we're just going to kind of quickly go through this. The war at home begins by converting everything in society to war production. There was a War Powers Act that was passed that gave the president an an incredible increase in the amount of authority that the president had in fighting the war. One of the things that's created is the War Production Board. That War Production Board was focused on converting peacetime commercial industries into war production machines. So a peacetime industry like Henry Ford's auto production is going to be converted into an airplane, warplane manufacturing plant. In fact, one of the biggest factories of that era was designed for making B-2 bombers, and eventually after the war, it's just going to be given over to the Ford company so that they can make cars. So the War Production Board, turning everything commercial-based in the society, or at least most of it, into production for the war machine. Now, how are they going to pay for all that? That's the question, because remember, when the war starts, we're still dealing with the Great Depression, which means unemployment was at 14% when the war starts. There's not enough tax money to pay for this incredible ramp up for the war. So they did a couple of things. One, they passed a victory tax. So by the end of the war, about 90% of the working class is paying taxes, but most of that victory tax initially was designed to get paid for by the wealthier folks. The other thing that happened was they started selling war bonds. Now, a war bond is simply a loan private people like you or I would make to the government. So this is just another way of saying a loan. You get a piece of paper and they say that you bought $5 in a war bond, and then in 10 years you'll get $10 back. Whatever the case is, it's a loan with interest. The United States borrowed $185 billion. Now, to put that in perspective, over 8 years of New Deal spending, the United States only added about $40 billion to the national debt. So over 8 years of New Deal, $40 billion over the 4 years of World War II spending, they're going to increase the national debt by about 6 times to about $250 billion. And they're buying things like bombs and guns and bullets instead of investing in things like schools and hospitals and bridges, but whatever. This is all deficit spending. So when you hear somebody say that the World War II ended the Great Depression, that ain't it. What ended the Great Depression was the massive amount of deficit spending that led to that increase in the national debt. The economy wanted the money. That's the thing that got us out of the Great Depression. And we can see that immediately, because of that war production, the United States unemployment rate went from about 14% down to about 2%. And we're going to see new people are able to get into that wartime economy, like women and African Americans that previously were locked out. The other thing about World War II is that the government really put a lot of controls on the economy. There's a lot of government mandated stuff going on here. So World War II is not this time of laissez-faire capitalism. There's an incredible amount of price controls, meaning the government told businesses how much they could spend. There's also wage controls. This means unions are going to be held in check because they can't go on strike to demand things. Everything in the society is being bent towards this war production. Also, and importantly, people were asked to sacrifice. There was rationing. You could only get a certain amount of meat, a certain amount of vegetables, a certain amount of rubber, a certain amount of gas, right? Rationing was put in place to make sure that the people on the front lines over and doing the fighting would have enough stuff. Also, the rationing was put in place so that the wealthy people couldn't hoard a lot of things. And living through a pandemic, you know how rationing and hoarding works, because during the pandemic, it was hard to get toilet paper for that first couple of weeks. Rationing was designed to prevent things like that from happening during World War II.